When does politics go too far? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Today's discussion will be a little bit different. It's a theoretical discussion, and I'll be trying to formulate my answer to the question as we talk. I've grappled with this query for quite some time, and I've been fumbling about with it, but maybe discussing this on air will help us clear things up. So, the question is, when do politics go too far? And I'm viewing that question in terms of the political spectrum, where you have the left and the right and everything in between. Now, when it comes to that question of when do things go too far, we seem to have an answer for one side of the spectrum very clearly, but when you go to the other side, it seems we're lacking that answer. When the right goes too far, it's very clear to people. When things like fascism and neo-Nazism and things like this crop up on the right, alarms begin to blare in our minds rightfully, and we've identified that there is a problem. But on the left, though, that doesn't seem to happen. And it's not that only bad people exist on the fringes of the right. There are bad people on the fringes of both sides of the political spectrum. It's not that everyone on the left is holy and everyone on the right is not. It's a naive way of thinking of things, but I do fear people have internalized that message. It's more so a fact that we as a society are not as good at detecting extremism on one side versus the other. Now, when I say we, I mean the collective societal institutions, not we as the individuals here. You as a person could very well have fleshed out an idea of how to identify when the left goes too far. I think I have an idea about it. But do these societal institutions have that same notion? Does the media have any idea about when to call out the left when it goes too far? Does the university system have any idea how to do that? Does the government? Do these large, meaningful institutions have the right roadmap? I think not. Institutions and individuals in prominent cultural positions cannot or will not identify extremism on the left, and as a result cannot or will not react appropriately to it. And that seems to be the situation we find ourselves in. It's very easy for those institutions to react and call out the far right, as they should. And that's good. But if you're applying all that pressure onto one side but letting the other side move unfeathered, you're going to have an imbalance there, and that's going to be extremely detrimental to our efforts to create a more productive society. If these institutions are fair arbiters of what you would consider moderation, then there is less ammunition on the fringes of the right and the left to get strong. And what I mean by that is, if you're on the far right and you see that the media does not do things to call out those who are your counterpart, on the far left you might feel jaded. You may begin to think that you actually are onto something, where if the media and institutions were calling out lunacy for lunacy, wherever it was, and there was no bias there, you have less of a leg to stand on, because the media is acting impartially, and that will be a signal to you that maybe you have it wrong. But because you're seeing discrepancies in judgment, you might think there is an agenda here, maybe you know something that the quote-unquote elite don't want to leak out, and it gives birth to many conspiracies. Not ideal to tackling the root issue here, which is extremism. Now, the first thing I'll point your attention to is the clear poles on the extremes of both sides, which is for the right fascism and for the left communism. The further right you go on the spectrum, the closer you get to some notion of fascism. And the further left you go on the spectrum, the closer you get to some notion of communism. Now, these are both horrid ideologies. Ideologies that have led to the torture and death of millions of people. For communism, think of Mao's China. Think of North Korea. Actually, speaking of North Korea, Jordan Peterson has an episode interviewing someone who escaped from North Korea, and it is just harrowing to hear about the horrors there that spawned from this ideology of communism. Then you have Pol Pot in Cambodia. There is no shortage of examples there. And for fascism, of course the most common one is Nazi Germany. And you also have Mussolini's Italy. And there are actually examples, perhaps today, of fascist-type regimes. Things to be on the lookout for. Now, these are where ideology goes wrong. A logical person would not want to find themselves in any of these camps here. I don't presume you'd want to immigrate to a fascist society or a communist one, unless you've been deluded into thinking that communism is something appealing, and that's the issue that I'm going to touch on. There actually has been great confusion and propaganda being committed on behalf of the institutions and being directed at groups like students who I would consider to be vulnerable. It's not impossible to find a professor or an authority figure or someone popular who is dabbling with the idea of communism, who aren't afraid to be tarred with the hue of it. Why? Because there really isn't such a strong, repulsive consequence to talking about that kind of stuff and being a fan of it. But compare that with the far right and fascism. Would there be anyone out there who is openly declaring themselves to be a fascist? I think not. Why? Because there would be extreme reputational harm that comes of it. And once again, I think that's rightfully so. Fascism is a despicable ideology, and nobody needs that. Nobody should want that. It's a terrible place to go. You have to be drawn back to the center if that's where your thinking is heading towards. But on the far left, where is the boundary there? At what point do we say, hey, you have to be drawn back to the center a little bit? You veered off track. I'm not too sure we even have that. There are professors and there are individuals, and if you're on social media and you're in these political circles, there are many people who are talking about the wonders of communism and how every time it's been tried, it hasn't been rightfully implemented, and there is hope for it. And they do that while disregarding the history of it, and all the deaths and destruction and despair that has come as a result of the ideology. If you want to quantify the far-right fascism with the far-left communism in terms of death and perhaps destruction that's been caused by them, there's no reason to be treating communism with kitty gloves and fascism rightfully in this dark way. Communism is just as bad, and even worse in certain regards. They are different ideologies, but they are abusive, dystopian systems. And to not be treating them as that equally, it's a mistake. So here you already have some inkling of a discrepancy. And one reason why people don't like fascism is because of the control aspect of it. Typically, it's associated with an authoritarian type of government. And you would presumably need something like that to really carry out a fascist agenda. But on the communism front, there's plenty of control there too. So, in society, when you see individuals on the far right who are vying for power and control, typically they be flagged by society and the media and institutions as people who you wouldn't want in power. But when you have those on the far left who are vying for that same power, that same control, and we know if they had things their way, they would definitely be trying to implement some type of communist-esque system. But still, here the game is once again a little bit different. There are candidates who are very affectionate with the notion of communism, but they're still realizing some degree of success. If you had candidates who were cozying up to the idea of fascism, I would presume the only support they would get is on the fringe of the right side of the political spectrum, aka a very minute amount of people. Now there's a discrepancy there, once again, and I do pose the question back at you, why is that? Is communism less of an abominable idea? Is it something that we should be entertaining? Or is it something that should be lumped in the same bucket as fascism? And I do tend to agree with the latter there. Now, moving on to the next thing that many people have observed is the sensitivity. Now, you may recall that perhaps a couple decades ago, it was more so the right wing of politics that would be concerned with regulating culture and condemning things that they thought was a deviation and stifling these free expressions and speech. I can think back to art and people wearing more revealing clothing, people doing things that were not considered traditional. You had the conservatives and the right wing up in arms about that, canceling people, shaming people, trying to get them to conform with the idea of conservatism. That was bad. It wasn't good. Then one day, institutions and authority figures realized that's probably not the best thing to do. Let people live their life, let them say what they want to do, let them engage in the activities they wish to. Freedom of thought, expression, all of that, very liberal ideas, and so that notion permeated the culture. Now, if you have a right-wing person telling you to cover up because indecent, they would get laughed at. But there is a weird change that occurred somewhere along the lines there, where the left looked at what the right was doing and they consumed the practice. In today's world, much of that canceling and shaming and getting individuals to conform with this preconceived idea of, instead of modesty, now it's wokeness, the left is very much culpable for the same things the right was doing before. And for some reason, the right is now, well, not the fringe, of course, but people to the center and center right, they are the ones who I see talking more about allowing for freedom of speech, diversity of ideas, and whatnot. And those on the far left are the ones who are complaining and trying to end that, trying to have it their way or the highway. But the key difference here, though, is the way the institutions have acted. They used to be on board with the free speech, free expression idea when it was coming from the left, but now they seem to be favoring the left still. So maybe it wasn't they liked the ideas, it was more so they liked the politics and the location of that system on the spectrum. They were cool with the left, but now that the right is talking about the ideas they supported before, they're not going to shift sides here. They're going to stick with what the left is saying, even though it's become quite oppressive, similar to what the right tried to do before. This difference in reaction, this reeks of hypocrisy, and it does raise the question again, when does the left go too far? Is there anything the left can try to cancel in the name of wokeness that the media would fight back against? Think about it. Is there anything that the left can cancel in the name of wokeness that would trigger the media and the government and institutions to take a stand? Big companies, whoever. And what would that be? It seems to me anything wrapped in the veil of wokeness would be allowed to pass through, because people would either be too afraid to combat that, or because they aren't willing to engage in the same rigorous free speech stances they used to have. I keep saying this throughout the episode. It's an issue. Now, moving on, when it comes to the idea of setting up boundaries between what we would consider to be generally acceptable as a rational individual versus what starts to veer off into radical thinking, it's important to note that standards differ across time and the world. So they have to be constantly updated. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with the world. So, in Canada, what we as a nation would begin to describe as the left going too far is not anywhere close to what perhaps Iran or China or Russia would describe as the Western left going too far. And that's fine, because the standards differ across the board. If we were operating based on what Iran wanted Western leftist principles to look like, well, things wouldn't be too good, I would imagine. The same goes for China and wherever else you want to put into that equation. So, geographics play a role there. Now, time also plays a role. It could be very well argued that in the 1900s, the left was nowhere near doing enough to fight for their values of equality and free expression and whatnot. Maybe they failed in that mission. They weren't anywhere close to touching the outer limits of what they were set out to do. And perhaps when you factor in culture and the systems of that time period, maybe they weren't able to go as far as they could have. So the question of when does the left go too far and when does the right go too far, that's very different depending on the time period you find yourself in. So to narrow the question down, I'm talking about when does the left go too far in North America in 2021? And the reason why I'm fixating on the left is because I think we already have the answer to when does the right go too far in North America in 2021. Now, you can show me anecdotal evidence of an individual not understanding when the right goes too far, but when it comes to these societal institutions, that's very different. They have no issue with identifying that. And the average educated, rational person has no issue identifying that. When it comes to identifying the same trends on the left, though, that's where the issue crops up most prominently. In today's environment, it's not like the far right is controlling the media and the institutions and whatever else you want to put out there. That is certainly not the case. But is the far left influencing these institutions unduly? I think that's very much so the case. You can look at corporations who are bending the knee to every woke notion. You can look at the news media and what is seemingly a left-wing bias for some of the most popular networks. You can look at whatever else you want to see here. Reactions to individuals who are committing crimes and how the media and people are going to respond to that depending on the skin color of someone. And this has been all warped by far left thinking and agenda making. This notion of modern day blasphemy is very interesting. It used to be something like the right-wing authority figures would like to have you jailed for disrespecting whatever, the prominent religious icons of the day. But in the modern day, those on the far left who do have more control over the institutions would like to have you arrested and perhaps charged for talking about the facts of biology. This is the world we live in. And in today's world, maybe in the past we didn't really quite understand when the right went too far. But today we do. And if the right wing tried to come up with blasphemy laws for Christianity or something trying to ban abortion, people would be up in arms about that. They would identify quickly that the right is going too far. But when the left is trying to ban your freedom of thought and expression on certain topics that might trigger someone or are deemed to be controversial, where are the alarms going off with that? And here is the thought experiment that I'm going to pose again. Is there anything the left can say under the veil of wokeness that would motivate the media and institutions to take a stand against them? I don't think so. Is there anything that AOC can say to get the media to turn against her if she's wrapping the message in wokeness? I don't think so. I really don't. The woke ideology does not have a limiter built into it. There is no authority figure checking it. It's running on its own algorithm and marching to the beat of its own drum. And we're going to reap the consequences of that very soon. Now, to try and establish finally some type of framework here, I'll put out that I do think that one sign of the far left going too far is when they try to stifle free, good faith debates because they think that what you're saying could be quote-unquote harmful or dangerous. The bottom line here is that the truth cannot and should not damage point of views that are legitimate. If you're afraid of engaging in free debate and free discussion because you fear the truth that could come out of that, well, perhaps the issue is with your point of view. I think that's one of the signs there, because why is it a sign of an issue? Because where does it lead? Once you start letting groups like that control the narratives that individuals can speak on and how they should speak on things, well, maybe they start to abuse that, and before long, many items are regulated in that way. Where if you say something even remotely controversial, you're being canceled, facing undue reputational harms, whatever. Now, this next point is very interesting. So, when the far right begins to focus their policies on race and gender and things like this, we know it's not going to go anywhere well. We've seen the results of that before. It's not a good thing. So how come when the fringe on the left begins to propose policies and changes based on race and gender and whatnot, that there is far less opposition to that? Do we somehow think that the left, or the fringe left, is better at managing these things? Do we think that they're more holy? Do we think that they're smarter? For me, the fringes on both sides are both equally foolish. And, therefore, I put a flag there. When one of the fringes of the political spectrum begins to focus in on arbitrary facts of your birth as the basis of policy and things like that, it seems to be a bad idea. And why is that? Because logically, it's foolish. And here's an example. So, for the COVID vaccine, this is interesting. People were saying, well, perhaps the African American community in America should be prioritized because they seem to have worse consequences Well, why is that? Well, let's presume one of the reasons perhaps is the low-income housing or something like that. Well, why would you even use race for a proxy if you know the actual cause of the issue? It's not the melanin in their skin that makes someone more susceptible to COVID. It's the underlying risk factors there. So if you're going to prioritize distribution, why not go straight to the risk factors and say if you live in low-income housing, which there could be white people there, or Mexican people, or Asian people, who presumably have these same conditions that they have to face, make it based on the conditions. Using skin color as a proxy is just idiotic. The funny thing is, if you would just use the economic conditions in that example, presumably whatever race is there in the most plentiful numbers would disproportionately get more of the resource because there's just more of them fitting the criteria. Really, the way that we've been operating in this regard is insane. But where is the institution there to call it out? Now, for the third criteria here, I do think that the far left can arguably go too far when they try to create conflict. And create conflicts in ways where they're framing their message in a way that gets you to look at the situation as some form of combat. Whether it's the oppressed versus the oppressors, whether it's the elite versus the non-elite, the educated versus the non-educated, the rich versus the poor. When they start framing things like this, how do you expect to not come up with conflict and battle and viewing things as a war? It's baked into the agenda and the messaging. Now, is that a productive way to go about organizing a society? I'm not sure. Maybe there are some cases where it's appropriate, but if we know anything about the history of communism, that's one of the fundamental pillars that brings it about, establishing this class conflict type of battle. And getting people ramped up about that, getting them angry. It's my opinion that politics is best discussed dispassionately, that is to say with no emotion, to regard it coldly and logically, to ensure that you're not being derailed and possessed by things that shouldn't be part of the consideration process. To be overly embedding these emotional triggers into your agenda seems like a mistake to me, and perhaps it could be a flag of when either side of the spectrum is going too far. So those were 3, and there are a lot more that we could talk about, but I do want to stop there because I want to give you a chance to think about some for yourself and to let me know what you think. And perhaps you want to debate some of the points I've mentioned, perhaps you want to add some. Feel free to leave a comment or reach out. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, but fundamentally my message is let's get this conversation going, because it's sorely lacking in any observer who's been paying attention to the discourse in the media and the public can notice this. And what I've said here today can probably get people on the far left angry. Why? Well, perhaps they don't want people to identify when they've gone too far. I'm open to the idea, of course, that maybe my pegs are wrong. Maybe I flagged areas that are not in fact accurate. But my question would then be, where would you put the flags? Where would you say the left goes too far? That we can exchange ideas. If they're simply just tearing down all the flags and not replacing them, that's actually a flag in and of itself. So very funny to keep an eye on that and see how this conversation progresses. So with that, it now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.